Hi guys. Okay, so question 1 says, turn what Bobby McFerrin, did into an experimental or quasi-experimental research design. So the first thing that I did is I looked at what the research question would have been for Bobby McFerrin if I were to create this in a research design. And the question that I came up with for him would potentially have been, will a random audience automatically know the pentatonic scale when given the first two notes? And so that would have been tested, that hypothesis would, or that question would have been tested through the research design of one group pre-test and a post-test design. And I think that that best represents what Bobby McFerrin did, because it said in the text that that with a one group pre-test post-test design, that you would have offered a comparison of the same individuals. So obviously we had the same large group both before and introduction of variables. So what I think that diagram would look like is an OXO, and it looks a little something like that. Hopefully you can see it. Yes. Okay. So you've got the observation here of the first observation, and then he introduces the different independent variables, which is how he jumped around to the different scales. And then he observed, secondly, what the audience did. And I actually went so far as to get it all the way down to 06. I actually diagrammed kind of what how he introduced the different variables. It was kind of cool. So first he observed the audience, and then he introduced the independent variables, and then observed them again. So basically he's measuring the subject's knowledge of notes by first jumping in place, and then he sings a note, and then he points to them and invites them to join in. And then he jumps to his left and sings one note higher to illustrate that, what he wants them to do. And so after being exposed to that example, the design follows OXO. So he repeats that experiment a couple of different times, introducing additional independent variables. And so some of those included, dipping one note below the initial note to see if they knew that note. He harmonized with their baseline, so once he got them going, he harmonized to see if they could continue to follow the pattern vocally, even though he himself wasn't singing that pattern anymore. So that was another independent variable that he introduced. He then tested them by not vocalizing several notes below the initial note that he did, and they intuitively knew those notes and sang them correctly. And then it was really interesting to me when he jumped in between two notes, because half the audience did one and half the audience did another. So I thought that was an interesting one. So all the dependent variables in this experiment were all of their responses. So they basically got it, and I was kind of intrigued at, obviously this was a neurology conference, as it seemed, and I thought it was kind of cool because they were showing sort of how the brain works and group think probably. Yeah, so as a researcher, so then question 3 says, so question 2, sorry, was define the independent and dependent variables, which I did. Question 3 says, explain how you'll measure your experiment, survey, observation, medically, etc. And as a researcher in this, I would obviously have observed the audience and recorded their vocal responses, whether or not they were on or not. And then I think it'd be interesting to survey the audience afterwards and to look at two different things. One would be how musical that audience is, and I would do that based on their own self-identification. So they'd answer questions such as, I play a musical instrument, or I have received formal musical education, things like that, where they self-identify as whether or not they're musical based on a ranking scale, probably 1 to 10, of, agree to strongly disagree, or yeah. And then I would also want to measure their impression of how well they perceive that the audience performed based on their knowledge. So I'd be interested in seeing whether or not those who had more of an ear for music, if they felt like the audience was closer to actually following the pentatonic scale versus those who maybe didn't have. I know, like for my husband, he's not vocally trained or musically trained, whereas I am, and I know sometimes things don't bother him where things do bother me sometimes musically. So I think it'd be interesting to sort of capture that in a survey. So the outcome of the experiment, as I see it, is at the end of his experiment, his hypothesis, I think, was supported in that he says, regardless of where I am, anywhere, any audience gets that. So I think in all of the times that he has performed this experiment that, he is proving basically that people can intuitively follow the pentatonic scale. So there you go.